Welcome to the Grab the Coffee podcast. We're so glad you are joining us today. And if you didn't know, which you probably know, there have been a lot of things happening in the financial world as of late that kind of connect to this overall theme that we've been hearing since COVID really happened about the oncoming recession that they don't know when it's going to happen. They just keep pushing it off, but predicting it happening. And so Trent and I have been talking a lot about this because obviously being in our 20s, new employees, pretty much new in our career, it is kind of intimidating to have to think about what is a recession, and although the world has seen many recessions before, what does that look like for us? And Trent, what is some of the background? Because we were talking about this yesterday, and you were telling me some of the tea on the earlier recessions slash market situations that have happened in the past.
Yeah, so I find this stuff pretty interesting. I know I think you like it more for the numbers, and just overall finance stuff, being your accounting brain. But I mean, I kind of like it just with the decision making, political policy, and just the background and the conspiracy theories. So just I don't know. There's always maybe some hidden motives in the banking, but so Silicon Valley Bank went under last week.
Yes, they officially, today's Friday, the 17th, St. Patrick's Day, and they officially declared bankruptcy. They filed for Chapter 11 today.
Okay. Now I know, so just for the government is bailing out the depositors, so people that put their money into the bank in good faith, like we have money in the bank that that's our money, and obviously whatever the bank does with it
trying to make
after
money
it's gone,
and be able to pay interest in it,
you know, so the people that had their money in there, which is great because that's what they use to pay payroll to their employees, so people are just getting paid. But I do enjoy it. The bank is going under. The government has said they're not going to bail out the bank, which I think is good.
They're not going to take over the bank.
Yeah.
So that's probably why they filed for Chapter 11 today, just because.
But
now they're going to try to.
There have been some other banks that closed, but just to go back, as far as kind of the lead up to the bank collapse, because in the Great Depression, the Great Recession, which happened in 2008, there was what kind of led up to the bank, or just the overall economy collapse.
Mm-hmm.
Bank closures is a pretty common
key
theme
factor. Yeah.
Now my kind of take on this SVB or situation is they got just super unlucky. So SVB it's been around forever. I watched a YouTube video. I think it said 1990, maybe before that. And
so kind of when tech started becoming kind of up and coming, because I know they concentrated mainly in tech and healthcare startups.
Yes, they were very undiversified. So almost all of their money came from one industry, which is part of the reason that kind of led to their downfall. So when the tech COVID hit, tech was booming. Everyone was work remote. Tech was huge.
You're gonna make billions if you work in tech.
And then the tech bubble had just been growing. I saw so much stuff if you invested in these tech stocks in 2010, you've made money every year. It was free money. Free money is what they call it. It's never free money. So they had all this money and they were getting all this extra cash flow, and banks don't really keep cash flow. So they did what was most people would consider smart. They put their money in government bonds, which is, I think, day one, Econ 101 college, the safest
thing you can do.
Safest thing you can put your money into. And you know, like that it's a long-term thing, but the issue with like kind of like that long-term like investment planning is it's like really difficult if you don't have like that cash flow.
Yeah.
Um, so SVB had all this money in government bonds, and with the kind of inflation after the pandemic, the feds have just progressively just kept raising their rates
Mhm.
for everything. So I think it was like 3%. Um, as far as like the housing rates, I think it's the Fed fund rate that uses it. I don't fully understand like all of it. Haven't looked into it, but I read they were like 17 billion. I think it could be million. I don't know. I don't remember. I want to say billion because it's a pretty big bank.
Yeah.
Under money. So they
Yes.
posted a 1.8 billion-dollar loss because they used their money to pay off like some the stuff they owned because they didn't have any money. So just super unlucky, I guess. And then
And then with all the tech stuff, kind of.
yeah, tech slowed way down. There's been a ton of layoffs. Meta just announced more layoffs on top of their previous 10,000. So like that bubble has like almost completely burst. So then their cash flow has slowed so much that they
Mhm.
couldn't make those payments.
Yeah.
And
Isn't it funny how like literally any time they say something is like unbreakable, like it's
it's always
it
gonna
can't fail.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
it always does fail.
Too big to fail.
Yeah. And
And
then
yeah,
what do you know? Within like a year, it's like that thing fails.
yeah. I'd
Like
say
whether it's the Titanic or just all these things that are too big to fail.
that's another conspiracy we can get into.
Okay, this is not the Titanic podcast. Although little tiny me would have loved the Titanic podcast.
Yeah. So just
Conspiracy theory 101.
allegedly they swapped the ships
They swapped
as
the
in
ship.
they
the ship-
sunk it as an insurance fraud. That's the theory. That's the theory.
That seems
Now,
like a lot of.
it
ships
doesn't
to
it
sink
doesn't
for-
like well, unlike the Titanic, it doesn't hold a lot of water. um but it just with that, and then like what we all learned about in like the Great Depression is like when you see some people, and like in the Great Recession when people started dumping the mortgage securities, like
Yeah.
once one person does it, like everyone has to do it.
And we were
because
talking
like,
about this on our walk the other day. Like, it's kind of that game where if one person doesn't take the money,
everyone,
you're all
yeah,
safe.
yeah,
But the minute someone takes the money, the minute someone takes the money, then like it's just a continual downfall. So like you either all have to trust each other or all not trust each other. But if you've like a kind of like I want to be safe, so I'm gonna run,
yeah.
then it's just like a downward
Yeah.
spiral.
So in like basic econ, it's called the prisoner's dilemma. It's basically like if both people make the like right choice, like they could both be positive. So like these people like would have been fine,
Uh-huh.
but they're not incentivized to ever do that because they make it out better if they pull their money out. If they're the first one. So you have to make the assumption that the other person is going to do what benefits them. So you need to pull your money out. So then you both lose. Like
Isn't that
and
crazy,
same
though?
thing with the Great Recession when everyone was. Now that may have been inevitable after kind of learning more about like what they were doing, which kind of like goes into a lot of like regulation changes were created out of the Great Recession in 2008. And even stuff like Sarbanes-Oxley, stuff like you work in tax with like Enron and everything.
Yeah.
And so
because the too big to fail thing kind of failed, and so they needed to figure out that there had to be some regulations because ethics were not the foundation of some
Yeah.
companies.
And just kind of overall, this whole situation, like I've seen on the media that it's like, oh, like the deregulation that happened in 2016 is the cause of this. Like the banks were too careless, but also those deregulations allowed this bank to get big. It's just they were a bit unlucky and maybe a bit careless in their diversity. So
Yeah.
like almost like deregulation creates a scenario where they can make money,
Yeah.
and be very successful, keep growing, but also there's a reason why these regulations exist. Um, and I think they were small, so they're not regulated at the same levels of like the big banks like
Yeah.
J.P. Morgan
Yes.
and Chase, and there's another one.
Where like the whole world would fall apart if those
But
banks fail.
without like these big massive changes, there's no incentive to make the change.
Yeah.
Like you have to have stuff break to be fixed. Like,
Yeah. I mean, in anything in life, kind of like if you don't fail at some point, you're never gonna grow because you're gonna think you're doing just fine.
yeah,
Until eventually, I think it's inevitable that something's gonna fail, something is gonna break, and you just have to kind of take what comes and build from it. Because I mean, a broken system can't go on forever.
yeah. And then so like just kind of, I know like the fears of a recession is just from like an overall standpoint, because like I know both of us don't want to see people struggle.
Yeah. Yeah. And I grew up, okay, all right. I don't know how many people are going to understand this, but I know Megan will. So, for our sake, I just have to mention this. But growing up, we loved American Girl dolls, all right? And we watched Kit Kat Ridge a lot, okay? And Kit Kat Ridge, she was my girl, and she was in the Great Depression. And, you know, her dad worked in, like, I think he honestly worked at a bank, got laid off, and then she was wearing, like, bags as clothing because her family could no longer afford to like buy clothing
they
that's
like
already made.
took the
Like the
burlap
sack.
sacks, yeah,
There you go.
and from the flour.
And she was scooting around like trying to sell eggs and everything. And so, you know, now being an adult where I'm funding, you know, like we're funding our own life and just thinking like, well, am I gonna have to go back to like burlap sacks and like selling eggs, you know, like that's like what my mind goes to, like what do you do when a recession happens? And how can we come out stronger on the other side? Because I was listening to a podcast yesterday where they were talking about the recession, how a recession is probably inevitable, although it's been an ongoing conversation of when it's going to happen for the past 3 years. And they've tried to navigate so it doesn't like crash and burn to where it's like a, you know, slow and steady burn, which, you know, half dozen one way.
Yeah, and I think that the government has managed to do that, and that's kind of like why we're seeing the inflation. But like with the stimulus checks and all of the things the government did, the PPP loans to keep places open. So it's almost like that's what the government's trying to do, and that's what they did in 2008 with the quantitative easing of like reducing the price of like the long term, just to create the short term.
Yeah. But
money.
But that podcast I was listening to yesterday was talking about how throughout history, like go back to the Romans, like any time in history, there's always a season of high growth, and then it does eventually have to fail. Like you go look at the Roman Empire, whatever, like it's gonna grow and then it's gonna fail. But that although no one wants to fail, like no one's like, oh, I'm just really excited. Yeah, like the economy's crashing, so that's really cute. That it needs to, because like you can't grow. I think one, you become complacent, and I think we honestly saw this towards 2020. Everyone was getting nervous, like the stimulus checks and the economy pre-COVID was actually doing really well, and I think we saw a spike in consumerism, like
Yeah.
consumer products were just going through the roof. And yes, there was some supply chain issues, but also companies were posting up like their sales were increasing a ton because people just kept buying. And I think when you have that and people feel like there's never like that there's a limitless amount of things they could buy, that eventually that has to get stopped. And the failing is not easy and it is scary. And something we've both talked about is like, you don't want to be the one impacted. You don't want to see anyone impacted. But, how can we manage it to the best we can? And you can't always live in fear for like every second of your freaking life.
Yeah. It just, like with the consumer, because I think just in America, there's like that like lifestyle creep in the consistency, like the new house, new car, new phone, new everything. It's very one, like, you see people balling on social media and social,
and we've talked
just
about
like
this, like
Instagram,
how much people
Twitter.
will use credit to fund that sort of lifestyle, and it's just not sustainable. And it's scary because when you do hit the recession, people do get hurt.
Yeah.
And, what do you, like, it makes your heart hurt, but also we can't just in that sort of like, oh, we can just all live to be billionaires. Because then, a bag of chicken nuggets, it's going to cost $200 because we all can't be billionaires.
Yeah. Might get up there.
So what is your 200 bags for a bag of chicken nuggets? That'd be nuts. But what would you say is your biggest fear of a recession? I mean, obviously, like not having enough money or whatever, but what's kind of, I guess not so much what's your greatest fear, but what's your greatest hope on the other side?
I know, like, it's like really hard, but like there's a lot of potential in recessions to have like good things. Like with the New Deal was in 1933 or 34 when FDR was elected. Like we had like the implementation of Social Security, maybe Medicaid. I'm not entirely sure, but I know that it was like.
Did welfare start too around then, or no?
Yeah. Okay. Well, Social Security, like. Yeah. I think they increased it quite a bit. But even just like the social work projects, like parks, infrastructure, just to like the big thing there was to get people working.
Yeah.
And it can lead to quite a bit. I know in 2008, I know a lot of people, because the housing market was huge at that time. There's so many people flipping and just millions and millions of dollars that they were making, but it tanked so hard that a lot of people were able to get houses that they didn't think they didn't think they were going to be able to afford. So, I mean, as far as a potential benefit to it is if we are able to kind of stay in a solid financial position, there is gains to be made. Now, on the other hand,
someone has to get hurt.
It's almost like a transition of what's the word? I'm like a redistribution of wealth, though. If like it creates a more opportunity for that top percent of wealth to purchase more stock, more land, with people going under if they foreclose on their houses, that's just another opportunity for big corporations to swoop in and or Airbnbers. So, if we see a new rent increase, but also like, job layoffs, job opportunities, it kind of creates this need for some like optimization and stuff that can be beneficial in a corporate space.
Yeah, I think it's something that I always struggle with is like okay, we see all this new technology that people keep saying like, oh, you know, this could lay off a lot of jobs. And they're just kind of waiting for companies to kind of take the financial risk to implement it, right? And it's like it takes a big moment, kind of like how COVID got a lot of people to work at home and kind of forced that change in what would be the traditional kind of structure.
Yep.
So if a recession, if companies are able to get extra cash and invest it into technology, I just wonder like what would the job market look like on the other side of that? Because jobs have to be created somehow. You can't just have a bunch of people just like floating around, just like no one can ever find a job. Because then you can't ever stimulate the economy. There's no cash flow.
Yeah, people need money to
And
work.
yeah, so because like if you're going to stimulate the economy, there has to be just constant, movement of cash. And how do you do that if so like that's why I sometimes struggle with technology is like it's going to take away jobs and then also like hearing a recession, and I think that's why sometimes I get probably too fearful about a recession is because I'm like, well, what does this look like for the world as a whole, for like people that are doing an amazing job at you know an Amazon facility, like they could be doing that with a lot of dedication and heart. But if someone decides to take the money and invest it into technology where they
We're
don't have to pay the
building
person,
robots and
yeah, like or with the chatbot or whatever, like what are the jobs they're going to create? But I also think we've talked about this of like work-life balance. That I also think companies shouldn't have struggled to value employees, and we've started to see that shift, and to fully force companies over to like force change, something big has to happen. And you brought up, you said like someone tried to put in a bill.
oh yeah, yeah. That we have a U.S. I think a House rep because I just don't think anyone in the Senate would ever be brave enough to bring this to the floor. But um, there was someone in Congress proposed a law that I'm sure it wouldn't like outlaw a 5 day work week, but maybe like make like the 4 day work week like the standard
Yeah.
because there's been a ton of success with it overseas. Like I
I
think
think they've seen increases in productivity from the financial things I follow. Like they've talked about that.
I'm sure I can you imagine how
But
nice
I
a
think
four
it's
day
so
work week would
interesting
be?
because I feel, and I've told you a lot about this, is although I think there's some benefits to capitalism, I think one of the negative things that we're seeing right now is it makes people extremely selfish. And I don't think you can do that forever if, because people could just continually want more, 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 more. And, you know, that's why people don't want to have a 4 day work week because
There's
if
gonna
it's
be
going to,
someone working five.
yeah.
Uh,
And I've also told you this, like some older guy, it's gonna be like, well, I had to work like that, so you should work like that. But be like, well, maybe you shouldn't have. Like
yeah,
that sounds like a personal problem, and things don't have to stay away some way just because that's the way we've always done it. Like that's just such a terrible perspective. Yeah.
so
But I just think we have to at some point implement change, and I think there's change needed. And so although a recession is very intimidating to me, and sometimes I just like I'll panic at work because I'm like, man, like is the recession gonna, how is it gonna impact us? But also like I at some point like is that what is needed to enforce change?
yeah, and I know we talked on our previous podcast just being like really risk adverse, but like there is absolutely like nothing we can do to
Yeah,
control
yeah,
anything.
like
So it's like whatever
kind of just
happens
embrace for
happens. Yeah,
impact.
like
Like I don't know. And I like to also remind myself, like, this has happened many a times before. Like, throughout history, there's been a probably a billion recessions and all this.
Yeah, I was
So
actually there was
we're not the first to have to live through this.
in
Although I feel like the news, sorry, I feel like the news does want you to believe that this is like
well
the
they get
biggest,
all the
better.
money
I
from the
know.
doom and gloom. There was
Hateful.
in like 1900s there was tulips in like France or somewhere
Uh-huh.
were like so popular people bought like I guess like in advance they purchased like I want this many like flowers or whatever.
Uh-huh.
So then but like something like killed all the tulips or whatever, so they
Oh,
had all this
tough.
money and it like completely caused like a little mini recession just because so many people wanted to buy flowers.
Oh my gosh.
It's pretty interesting. I don't remember what it was called.
That's crazy.
Maybe we put a link to it
Yeah.
in,
Yeah. I'm curious too
but
cuz like
that's why
but
they're the
but
best
like
flower.
they it just happens all the time, and people still make it out. It is hard, but we're all going to have to go through hard at some point. And what's the fun in an easy life? Sometimes, random side note, that's like what I've talked to people about. Like sometimes what I get scared about of like the idea of heaven. Like cuz I think pain is so critical to growth. You got to fail, it's got to hurt, and then you come back on the other side of that and you're like, I did it. Like when I'm training for a marathon right now, it sometimes hurts. But then sometimes I think about like when I cross that finish line and I just, I can just be like, I did it. Like I did it.
So you think those benefits like kind of going through it and just seeing like
Yeah.
like
Like we lived through it. We made it out. You kind of get that confidence that like, okay, I've done this before. The next time we go through it, we have a little bit more experience. So I think this time, and I'm sure, people out there who went through 2008 are like,
no,
it's
never
still
do that
scary.
again. Yeah.
But for us, like never having gone through any sort of, because like even the .com bust in 2000, like all these things where there's a downturn, and being first timers in what could be something like that, it is very intimidating, I feel like, because you just don't know what it looks like. You've never been through it. You've got nothing to back it up. You just have a book to kind of help you understand it. And so I think that's but it's also kind of exciting if you are able to reframe it in a way of like, I can use this as a learning opportunity. I know that if we go down, we're going to come back up stronger. And so taking that perspective instead of like the doom and gloom, like we're all going to just melt into the world and it's all going to go downhill from here and there's just no recovery. And if you listen to the news a little too much, like that's what you're going to get. And maybe I'm an optimist, but I just like to think that we can make better out of it and that we need better. Like I've told you this, but like consumer culture, like it just sometimes hurts my heart. One, because of the environment, like all the poor chicken nuggets out there just getting wrecked, like the sea turtles just getting wrecked.
Yeah.
By
Well,
our
that's
trash
like the hardest thing. I think like people that struggled in 2008, like the U.S. was like super badly affected, but like where the U.S. economy goes, like the whole world goes.
Yeah.
And it was similar in like the Great Depression, Great Recession. Like when they struggle, then everywhere else struggles even harder. Like the smaller countries that rely on imports or exports, I guess. They're probably not importing a ton. And then areas of like massive, it's not like inflation. There's another term that's worse than inflation where like the rate goes like so much higher that like your money becomes absolutely worthless and like you can't buy a single thing. I can't think of the term right now.
But insert word here.
Yeah. That happened in a country, I think in like North Africa.
Yeah. So, do you think a recession brings out people's like quote unquote true colors?
No.
You don't think so?
No.
Like, does it make people inherently better? Like, from not like a financial standpoint or whatever, but from like a human perspective. Does it make people like softer? Instead of, because I think that's, I just hate how sometimes capitalism feels like it just makes people real greedy and really needy. And the other podcast I listened to with Deepak Chopra, he was talking about how we've used our imaginations to create so many amazing things, but haven't done anything to, have world peace. Like, we haven't used our imaginations to create something that's like
Good for everyone.
yes. And so, do you think a recession makes people focus more on a togetherness instead of a me?
I think it's almost the opposite. I would say that,
You think
like,
so?
yeah, I think people just do.
Because it's like
They do what they have to do because they're forced to or they're desperate.
So, do you think if people, what has to shift from an economic perspective to get people, or is it just like it's never going to happen? People are always going to be greedy.
I think it'd be like a mindset shift. Like we have what we need. We need to help other people.
But how do you get there?
I don't think it's possible.
You don't think so?
Yeah.
Isn't that sad? Like, why can't we all just want to add a little bit of like love and lightness into the world, It just makes my heart sad sometimes. Because I think that's what the world needs.
Yeah, I would agree. Just so many people getting to that point. It's just so difficult to do.
Yeah. And it's always, people always are just going to want more.
But it all starts with one person. I know, like, some of the stuff within, like, kind of in economic downturn is you have people that step up and, like, open charities or take in donations or come up with different creative ways to get people the support they need.
I hope that's what we do. Instead of just focusing on like even if we get directly impacted, because there's that chance. Like, we could be one of the people that are severely impacted, but that we shift it as an opportunity to find a creative way to do good instead of be like, oh no, the world's falling apart, I'm falling apart. Yeah. I'm going to focus on some negative thoughts and just be in my own like deep hole, which is easy to get into. Like, trust me, I've been there, done that. And instead focus on like those higher thoughts.
Yeah. And the people that were directly affected in 2008, I know, like, there was that big shift where almost like there was so much competition for jobs that, like, entry-level jobs became like you needed like 3 or 4 years of experience or whatever, because there was just so much of those people available. But those people that were directly affected and struggled through it, they are now probably in a better situation where in economic downturn, it's just, I think it's easier to have like sympathy or empathy.
I always say both of them together because I'm like, I have no idea which one means which.
Yeah. But hopefully they're in a position now where because they know the struggle, so like it'll help other people through next recession. Now, not saying the baby boomers were a little selfish, but I think there was quite a long period between the 50s and the 2008, and I think there was one in maybe the 70s. So it was
remembering to focus on the positives and not look at the doom and gloom, and also because we don't know when it's going to happen, and like Trent said, like, there's nothing we can do to control it. Like, it is so far out of our hands that our choice is how we're going to act in it. And you can quotes prepare, but like at the end of the day you can't really prepare, I don't think.
Yeah, and it presents an opportunity where you can become closer with friends, closer with family,
especially if we're moving into the basement.
Yeah,
shout out mom, dad. Something does happen, we're moving in. We'll take the bedroom right next to your guys. You're
Yeah,
welcome.
we have what, plan B, C, and D.
Yeah. Just rotating around. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us today. Catch us next week and check the link in the bio for all the other details on our socials and websites, etc. See you next week.